My name is Maya, 32 years old, and I am done being the punching bag for my family. At a $500 a plate dinner in Atlanta, my sister sneered, telling me not to fill my plate because I did not pay for it. My mother smiled, praising her white son-in-law, while mocking my so-called little catering gig. I simply nodded, put on my coat, and walked out. Moments later, the manager handed my brother-in-law a bill for almost $5,000. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who they are dealing with. We were seated in the private dining room of the Sovereign Atlanta's most exclusive steakhouse. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the mahogany table. It was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my sister Chloe and her husband Preston. I reached my fork toward the center platter to take a small piece of butter-poached lobster. Before my fork could even touch the meat, my younger sister Chloe suddenly swatted my hand away. The sharp clatter of silver hitting fine china echoed loudly through the room. "Don't fill your plate!" Chloe sneered, her voice loud and carrying an undeniable edge of malice. "You didn't pay for this. Leave the lobster for the people who actually contribute to this family." I slowly lowered my hand, remaining neutral. I looked at Chloe, draped in a flashy designer dress, maxing out her credit cards. She sat pressed against Preston, her husband of 2 years. Preston sat swirling his bourbon, leaning back with a smug expression. His tailored suit sleeve was pulled up just enough to flash his gold watch. It was a fake Rolex, but my trained eye knew exactly what it was. He loved to flaunt it like a badge of superiority. My mother Brenda did not reprimand Chloe. Instead, she smiled warmly, patting Preston's arm. "Chloe is just being honest." "Maya," my mother said, her tone dripping with that familiar condescension I had endured my entire life. "Real family takes care of their own, and Preston here is treating us all tonight. He and Chloe just closed a massive commercial real estate deal. That is what generational wealth looks like." She turned her gaze to me, her eyes scanning my simple red silk dress with barely concealed pity. "Maybe if you focused more on building a real business, instead of that little catering gig of yours, you could afford to eat like this on your own dime. When are you going to stop cooking for other people and finally get a real job?" A little catering gig. That was how my own mother described my life's work. She had no idea that my little gig had evolved over the last decade. To her and my father Marcus, sitting silently nearby, I was just the designated scapegoat. I was the dark-skinned daughter who refused to straighten her natural hair, who refused to marry for status, who refused to worship the ground. Preston walked on simply because he was a white man, speaking in corporate buzzwords. To them, Preston represented proximity to power, and they willingly offered me up as a sacrifice to keep him entertained. Preston chuckled, adjusting his cuffs with arrogance. "Now, Brenda, don't be too hard on Maya. The world needs people to serve the food. I can always see if my firm needs someone to cater our next board meeting. We usually hire high-end culinary teams, but I am sure we could throw her a bone and give her some exposure." Chloe beamed at him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You are so generous, babe, but honestly, her food might not be up to your investors' standards. We would not want to embarrass you in front of the board." The sheer audacity of their performance hung heavily in the air. For years I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had endured the snide remarks at Thanksgiving, the constant comparisons to Chloe, the way my parents practically bowed down to Preston while ignoring my existence. But tonight, something inside me finally clicked. The invisible chain of obligation they had wrapped around my neck simply snapped. I felt a profound clarity wash over me. I did not yell or cry. I picked up my linen napkin, wiped the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly on the table. I pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my red dress with absolute precision. "You are absolutely right, Mom," I said, my voice calm, steady, and smooth as glass. "Real family does take care of their own. And Preston, thank you so much for your incredible generosity. I hope the lobster is everything you dreamed of." Chloe rolled her eyes, dramatically crossing her arms. "Where are you going? Throwing a tantrum because you got called out for freeloading?" "I am going home, Chloe," I replied, sliding my arms gracefully into my tailored cashmere coat. "I have a very early morning tomorrow with my little catering gig. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone." I walked out of the private dining room without looking back. My heels clicked rhythmically and confidently against the polished marble floors of the restaurant. I stopped at the host stand near the entrance where the general manager was waiting for me. I smiled at him, slipping my solid metal black card back into my designer clutch. Cancel the pre-authorization on table 4, I instructed quietly. They will handle their own check tonight. He nodded professionally, completely understanding the assignment. Right away, ma'am. Have a wonderful evening. I stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night air, breathing in freedom. 5 minutes later, as I was stepping into the back of my waiting tinted car, I knew exactly what was unfolding inside that dining room. The manager approached their table with a perfectly neutral expression, carrying a heavy leather folder. He placed it directly on the table in front of Preston. "Sir," the manager said, his voice carrying perfectly across the sudden dead silence of the private room. "The woman in the red dress just canceled the VIP black card pre-authorization for this table. Here is your bill for $4,850. Preston's arrogant, smug smile vanished instantly. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale as his hands began to tremble. He stared at the total on the receipt, his eyes wide with sheer panic, desperately fumbling through his pockets for a wallet he knew could not cover the cost. I sat in the back of my Maybach, the engine purring. I opened an acquisition file. My catering business was doing perfectly fine. My phone lit up. It vibrated so violently it nearly bounced off the center console. The family group chat was exploding. I watched the frantic messages roll in, each showing the panic unfolding back inside the private dining room. Mom wrote Preston's cards were declining. Dad demanded I fix this before the manager called the police. Chloe typed in all caps that I ruined her dinner. I pictured Preston sweating through his suit, handing over useless plastic, while the polite manager refused to let them leave an unpaid tab. My parents, realizing the wealth they worshipped was a mirage. A text from my father popped up. "We had to leave our wedding rings as collateral so they would not arrest us. You are a disgrace to this family." I chuckled. The screen switched to a call from Chloe. I let it go to voicemail. The notification pinged. I calmly pressed play. "You are dead to me," Chloe shrieked. "You planned this. You set us up because you are exactly what Preston always says you are. A bitter, jealous black woman who cannot stand to see her sister happy. You cannot get a successful man of your own, so you have to ruin my marriage. Preston comes from a good family. He has investments. He has a trust fund. You are just a lonely caterer who will never have what I have. You are pathetic." I listened to the vile words, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical precision. Chloe had internalized every toxic stereotype Preston fed her, weaponizing our race and my supposed single status to elevate her white husband. My parents had co-signed this behavior for years, treating Chloe as the ultimate success story, simply because she married a man who looked like wealth and spoke with unearned authority. They genuinely believed I was sitting in my kitchen weeping over mixing bowls, agonizing over my lack of a husband. They did not know that while Preston was maxing out credit cards to buy tailored suits, I was buying commercial real estate. I did not block Chloe's number. I did not type out an angry response defending my character. Emotional reactions were exactly what they expected from the scapegoat. Instead, I opened a secure application on my phone tied directly to my private financial network. As a major player in the commercial sector, I had access to comprehensive credit analytics. I typed in Preston's full legal name and his social security number, which I had legally obtained months ago when he foolishly applied to lease office space in a building he did not know I owned. The report generated instantly. It was a bloodbath of financial ruin. There was no trust fund. There was no generational wealth. Preston had exactly $80,000 in defaulted personal loans. He had 4 maxed-out credit cards, 2 repossessed vehicles, and a credit score that would not qualify him to finance a used bicycle. His entire lifestyle was funded by debt and lies. I took a clean, high-resolution screenshot of the exact page showing his massive defaults and zero assets. I opened the family group chat, which was still receiving a steady stream of angry messages from my mother. I attached the screenshot. Beneath it, I typed a single simple sentence. "Tell your successful husband to pay off his loans before he buys lobster." I hit send and watched the screen. The typing bubbles from my mother and sister appeared, then vanished. Then appeared again. Then stopped completely. The group chat went dead silent. The truth had dropped like an anvil, crushing their delusions in real time. I locked my phone, tossed it onto the passenger seat, and instructed my driver to head straight home. The morning sun streamed through the massive bay windows of my suburban home, casting bright light across the hardwood floors. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring myself a cup of freshly brewed coffee, feeling more rested than I had in years. The silence from my family had lasted through the night. I knew it was not the silence of reflection. It was the silence of people scrambling to regain control after their entire worldview had been shattered. At precisely 8 o'clock, a sharp, heavy knock echoed through the foyer. I set my coffee mug down on the granite island and walked to the front door. I swung it open to find a man in a rumpled suit standing on my porch, holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Maya, looking down at a clipboard. I replied evenly that I was. "You have been served," he said, shoving the envelope into my hands before turning on his heel and walking briskly back to his sedan. I closed the door and opened the envelope, pulling out a stack of legal documents bearing the seal of the county court. I scanned the first page, my eyebrows raising in genuine amusement. It was a formal eviction notice and a lawsuit filed by Brenda and Marcus. My parents were suing me. The documents demanded that I immediately vacate the premises. The attached letter from their lawyer stated that due to my blatant disrespect and malicious actions against the family, they were officially kicking me out of their house. They claimed the property was a family asset, and that my right to live there was revoked effective immediately. They actually believed they had the power to throw me out onto the street. They actually thought they could punish me by making me homeless, assuming they held the ultimate authority over my living situation. I walked back to the kitchen, tossing the lawsuit onto the counter next to my coffee. I could not help but smile. My parents were about to learn a very hard and legally binding lesson about who actually owned the ground they walked on. I barely had time to set my coffee mug on the coaster before I heard the electronic chirp of my front door keypad. I had changed the locks a year ago, but my father still had the override code for emergencies. Apparently, protecting a fragile white man ego qualified as an emergency. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. I walked calmly into my home office, a sleek room with floor-to-ceiling glass partitions, and sat behind my custom walnut desk. I opened my laptop, projecting absolute indifference. Seconds later, my office door swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. Preston walked in first, leading the charge like a conquering general. He wore a different tailored suit today, though I knew it was likely financed on a credit card, carrying a 29% interest rate. Following closely behind him were my sister Chloe and my parents Brenda and Marcus. Preston marched directly to my desk and slammed a duplicate copy of the eviction notice onto the polished wood. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on my desk, attempting to physically intimidate me. "Listen to me carefully," Maya, Preston said, using that slow, measured tone. "Men like him reserve for women they believe are inferior. I know legal documents can be confusing for someone without a formal business education, so let me break this down for you. You live in a house owned by a family trust. Your parents are the trustees. You disrespected them, you disrespected my wife, and you disrespected me. Under Georgia property law, a tenant at sufferance can be removed with immediate effect. Pack your things." Chloe peeked out from behind his shoulder, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "You brought this on yourself, Maya. You thought you could embarrass my husband and get away with it. Mom and Dad are sick of your attitude." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, interlacing my fingers. I looked past Preston and locked eyes with my father. Marcus shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable but resolute. He stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Preston, creating a unified front against his own daughter. "We did not want it to come to this, Maya," my father said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of toxic authority. "But you left us no choice. Preston has a massive commercial real estate deal on the table. It is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that will secure Chloe's future and elevate this entire family. But because of your little stunt last night, his investors are asking questions. He needs capital immediately to close the escrow." My mother, Brenda nodded vigorously, stepping up beside my father. "We are a family," she declared, her tone completely devoid of maternal warmth. "And family makes sacrifices for the greater good. Since you clearly do not appreciate the roof we provided over your head, you are going to sign over the equipment and the client list from your catering company to Chloe. Preston can liquidate those assets by Friday. It is the least you can do to pay us back for ruining our dinner and insulting a man of his stature." I sat there in absolute silence, letting their demands hang in the air. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was breathtaking. My own parents were demanding I cannibalize my entire livelihood, the business I built from scratch with zero support from them, just to fund the imaginary empire of a white man who was drowning in debt. They were willing to render their black daughter homeless and destitute to buy the approval of a son-in-law who secretly despised them. Preston smirked, mistaking my silence for submission. "It is just business, Maya. Do not take it personally. If you sign the asset transfer agreement today, I will convince your parents to give you a week to move your stuff out. Maybe you can find a nice little apartment across town." I reached out and gently tapped the intercom button hidden beneath the edge of my desk. Then I picked up the eviction notice Preston had slammed down, folded it neatly in half, and dropped it directly into the paper shredder beside my chair. The machine whirred loudly, destroying the document in seconds. Preston's face flushed bright red. "What is your problem? I just told you the law." "You told me a fairy tale, Preston," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "And you clearly failed to run a basic title search before you decided to play lawyer." I picked up my phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. I pressed the speakerphone button and set the device in the center of the desk. The line rang once before a sharp professional voice answered the call. "Good morning, Madam CEO," my lawyer said. "How can the legal team assist you today?" Preston frowned, glancing at Chloe, who suddenly looked very unsure of herself. "Good morning, David," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on Preston. "I need you to activate the true deed for the residential property file. Also, immediately cancel the rent-free tenancy agreement I granted to Marcus and Brenda. They have violated the terms of our arrangement." "Understood completely," David replied without missing a single beat. "I will file the termination notice with the county clerk within the hour. 30 days notice to vacate will be issued to them today. Will that be all?" "Yes, David, thank you." I ended the call. Preston let out a loud barking laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You hired a fake lawyer to pretend you own this house. You are actually psychotic, Maya. Your parents bought this place 5 years ago. I saw the trust paperwork myself." Before I could answer, the office door opened again. 2 towering men in sharp black suits stepped into the room. They were my private armed security detail, standing silently but imposing. My mother gasped, grabbing my father's arm as the men took their positions behind my chair. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy certified legal document bearing a raised gold seal. I placed my hand flat on top of it and slid it across the smooth walnut surface until it bumped directly against Preston's knuckles. "You saw a fake trust designed to protect my parents' fragile egos," I explained, watching the arrogant smile slowly melt off Preston's face. "When they faced bankruptcy 5 years ago, they came begging to the daughter they loved to hate. I paid off their debts. I bought this house. I bought the house you and Chloe live in. In fact, I own the entire suburban subdivision you drove through to get here." Chloe snatched the document from the desk, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. Her breath hitched as she read my name listed as the sole proprietor of the holding company that owned every single property deed in their neighborhood. "You do not have the power to evict me, Preston," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "But I have the power to evict all of you. My security team will escort you off my property now. You have exactly 30 days to pack your things." My security detail flanked them immediately. Preston tried to puff out his chest, but the towering presence of my guards forced him to stumble backward. Chloe's mouth hung open in shock as they were marched out of my glass-enclosed office and shoved into the crisp Atlanta afternoon. I watched from my window as they stood in the parking lot. Instead of accepting defeat, Chloe pulled out her phone. Within 10 minutes, my assistant walked in and placed a tablet on my desk. Chloe was on Instagram Live. Her mascara was perfectly smudged to look like she had been weeping for hours. She stared into the camera, squeezing out crocodile tears for her thousands of followers. "My own sister is a monster!" Chloe sobbed into the lens, her voice trembling with practiced victimhood. "She is trying to throw our elderly parents out onto the street. She is committing real estate fraud to fund her ghetto catering business. She hates my husband because he is a successful white man, and she cannot stand seeing us thrive. Please share this. Do not let her get away with abusing our family." The video went viral before the hour was over. The blogs picked it up. The comments flooded in, calling me a bitter, jealous woman trying to destroy her own flesh and blood. My phone began to ring. Two of the high-profile catering clients I still personally managed for public relations purposes called to cancel their upcoming galas. They claimed they could not associate with someone exhibiting such toxic family values. If Chloe lit the match, my mother poured the gasoline. By the next morning, Brenda was sitting in front of a microphone on one of Atlanta's most popular local gossip podcasts. I listened to the audio while reviewing my quarterly earnings. "I have no daughter named Maya," Brenda announced to the podcast host, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "I raised her better than this. She has always been resentful of the finer things in life. Preston is the true son I never had. He stepped up to care for this family while Maya turned her back on us for a few dirty dollars. Preston is a brilliant businessman, a provider, and a gentleman. Maya is just an angry woman who will end up completely alone." They wanted me to break. They wanted me to post an emotional rant on social media, to defend my character in the comment sections, to beg for my catering clients to come back. They expected the stereotype of the loud, angry black woman defending her honor against a coordinated smear campaign. I did absolutely none of that. I closed the podcast tab and took a sip of my sparkling water. Social media outrage is the currency of the powerless. I dealt in actual currency. I checked my security network tracking on Preston. Since he was desperately trying to secure capital for his failing real estate deal to replace the eviction notices, I knew exactly where he would be. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which meant Preston was at the elite Buckhead Heritage Country Club. It was a notoriously exclusive establishment where Atlanta's old money gathered to play golf, smoke cigars, and pretend they still owned the world. Preston spent 90% of his waking hours there desperately networking and pretending he belonged. What Preston did not know was that Buckhead Heritage had recently been acquired by a private equity group to stave off bankruptcy. I picked up my phone and called the country club executive director directly on his private line. "Mr. Sterling," I said smoothly when he answered. "This is Maya." "Madam Chairman Sterling," replied, his voice instantly dropping into a tone of absolute deference. "How can I assist you today?" "As the majority shareholder of the parent company that holds the deed to your prestigious club, I am conducting an audit of our membership roster. I need you to immediately revoke the membership of Preston Vance. Code of conduct violation. Effective this very second. Do not allow him to pack his locker. Remove him from the premises publicly. Consider it done." Sterling responded without a moment of hesitation. Across town on the pristine 18th hole of the Buckhead Heritage Golf Course, Preston was holding court. My private investigators later sent me the full security footage of what unfolded. Preston was standing on the lush green grass holding a custom titanium golf club. He was surrounded by three incredibly wealthy older investors. He was flashing his fake Rolex, laughing loudly, and pitching them his fraudulent real estate startup. I was minutes away from securing a handshake deal that would have bailed him out of his $80,000 debt. He pulled his club back, ready to demonstrate his perfect swing. Before the club could even reach the apex of its arc, 3 electric golf carts swarmed the 18th hole, tearing across the manicured grass. 4 burly security guards in dark polo shirts jumped out and surrounded Preston. The lead guard stepped right into Preston's personal space. "Sir, your membership has been permanently revoked by the ownership board. You are currently trespassing on private property. You need to leave the course immediately." Preston lowered his golf club, his face turning a vibrant shade of crimson. He looked at the 3 wealthy investors who were staring at him in utter confusion and mounting disgust. "There is a mistake," Preston stammered, trying to laugh it off and play it cool. "I am a premier member. I play here every Tuesday. Do you know who I am? Get the manager on the phone." "The manager sent us," the guard replied coldly. grabbing Preston by the arm. The chairman of the board flagged your account for fraud and conduct violations. You are leaving now, or we are calling the police to have you arrested for trespassing. Preston tried to pull his arm away, trying to salvage his dignity in front of the men he was begging for money. But the guards gave him no quarter. They physically grabbed him by the belt and the collar of his expensive polo shirt, marching him away from the golf hole. They tossed him into the back of the security cart like a common criminal. Preston looked back frantically at the three investors. "Gentlemen, please wait. I can explain. It is just a misunderstanding with my crazy sister-in-law. We can still close the deal." The oldest investor, a man who managed billions in actual wealth, looked at Preston being hauled away in the golf cart. He pulled out his phone, dialed his assistant, and spoke loudly enough for Preston to hear as the cart drove off. "Cancel the funding transfer for Preston Vance. The man is a complete fraud. He does not even have the capital to keep his country club membership active. Cut all ties immediately." Preston sat in the back of the security cart, humiliated, his face buried in his hands, watching his final lifeline vanish into thin air. He was now entirely, completely, and utterly ruined forever. Preston's humiliation at the country club quickly morphed into unhinged, desperate rage. Less than an hour after being physically escorted off the 18th hole by security, he stormed through the revolving glass doors of a gleaming 60-story high-rise in downtown Atlanta. This was the address listed on my catering company invoice from years ago. In his arrogant, narrow mind, he assumed I was merely renting a tiny basement commercial kitchen in the service sector of the building. His expensive golf polo was wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. Chloe was trailing right behind him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the imported Italian marble floors. She looked like a woman watching her fake empire crumble, desperate to find a scapegoat to blame for her husband's sudden financial panic. Preston marched straight to the polished mahogany front desk, slamming his fist down hard enough to startle the young receptionist. "I demand to speak to the property manager immediately," Preston shouted, his voice echoing aggressively across the expansive, quiet lobby. "I am filing a massive lawsuit today. One of your commercial tenants is a rogue caterer who just committed corporate sabotage against my firm. I want her lease pulled right now. I want her evicted from this property before the sun goes down." Chloe stepped up beside him, pointing an accusing finger at the bewildered receptionist. "You better listen to him. My husband comes from a good family. His family has old money and real lawyers. My sister is nothing but a jealous, bitter caterer trying to ruin my marriage because she cannot secure a successful provider of her own. She operates out of the basement of this building, and we are going to crush her pathetic little business into dust. Get the owner of this building down here right now." The property manager, a distinguished older gentleman named Mr. Caldwell, stepped out of his ground floor office. He buttoned his suit jacket calmly, completely unbothered by Preston, throwing a tantrum in the middle of a corporate lobby. He walked over to the desk, assessing Preston's disheveled appearance with a look of mild professional disgust. "Sir, I am the property manager," Mr. Caldwell said evenly. "But you are making a severe miscalculation. I cannot evict the tenant you are looking for." Preston scoffed, his face turning a vibrant shade of crimson. "Why not? Do you know who I am? I have the best legal team in Atlanta on a permanent retainer. If you harbor a malicious tenant, I will sue your management company into absolute bankruptcy. Bring me the real owner of this high-rise so I can handle this man-to-man." Mr. Caldwell offered a polite, incredibly dry smile. "I would love to help you, sir, but the owner of this building is standing right behind you." A soft melodic chime echoed through the lobby. The brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator slid open. I stepped out wearing a flawless tailored ivory suit, my natural hairstyle to absolute perfection. I held a sleek leather folder in my manicured hands. I stopped a few feet behind Preston and Chloe, watching their aggressive posture completely evaporate. Preston spun around. His jaw practically hit the marble floor. Chloe took a step back, her eyes darting frantically between me, the private elevator, and the property manager. "Maya," Chloe stammered, her voice suddenly losing all its volume and bravado. "What are you doing up there? You are a caterer. You belong in the service kitchen." I walked past them and stood next to Mr. Caldwell, who gave me a respectful nod. That is the problem with your entire worldview, Chloe. I said, my voice smooth and commanding. You and our parents were so obsessed with proximity to whiteness that you never bothered to ask how I actually funded my life. You assumed because I loved culinary arts, I was just the hired help. You assumed Preston was the peak of success simply because he looked the part and spoke with unearned authority. Preston tried to puff out his chest, attempting to reclaim his shattered authority. I do not care if you tricked some bank into letting you buy an office space. You sabotaged my funding at the golf course. You cost me a $50 million deal. My family will bury you. Your family cut you off financially 3 years ago. Preston, I replied casually, dropping the heavy truth like a stone. I know this because when you started your little real estate tech startup, you shopped it around to every private equity firm in the South. You were rejected by all of them because your business model was a complete joke. Preston swallowed hard. How do you know that? Because I am not a caterer, I stated clearly, letting the reality wash over them. I am the founder and chief executive officer of M Empire, a billion-dollar commercial real estate and hospitality conglomerate. I own this high-rise. I own the country club that just threw you out. I own the catering company that services the elite galas you desperately try to sneak into. Chloe grabbed Preston's arm, her hands shaking visibly. Preston, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying. Tell her your investors are still backing us. But Preston could not speak. He was staring at the leather folder in my hands, a sudden look of pure terror washing over his features. He was finally connecting the dots. Since you failed to secure traditional funding, Preston, you turned to predatory lenders to keep up your wealthy facade for my sister and my parents. I continued opening the folder. You took out a massive high-risk loan against your startup to pay for your luxury cars, your tailored suits, and the lobster dinners you like to brag about. But you missed your last 3 payments. Preston took a step back, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked like a terrified child. You do not have access to my private company debt. I did not just access it, Preston. I smiled, sliding the official financial document out of the folder and holding it up for him to see. When a high-risk lender wants to offload bad debt, they sell it to larger conglomerates for pennies on the dollar. Your lender sold your portfolio yesterday morning. I just bought the debt to your failing startup. I do not just own this building, I own you. Preston's face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. He took a step forward, raising a trembling finger at me, trying to summon the corporate authority he had relied on his entire life. You think buying distressed debt gives you leverage? He sputtered, his voice echoing shrilly in the vast lobby. I will tie you up in litigation for a decade. I will sue you for tortious interference, predatory lending practices, and breach of covenant. My family lawyers will strip this building from you. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the leather folder held by my assistant and pulled out a stack of documents stapled together. I slapped them hard against Preston's chest, forcing him to catch them before they hit the marble floor. You cannot afford a lawyer to file a simple motion, let alone a decade of corporate litigation, I replied, watching his eyes dart across the top page. Those are your Chapter 11 bankruptcy drafts. Your former accountant handed them over to my acquisitions team during the due diligence phase. You are broke, Preston. You have been broke since the day you met my sister. Before Preston could formulate a lie to save himself, the heavy revolving glass doors at the front of the building spun rapidly. My parents, Brenda and Marcus, burst into the lobby. They were both out of breath, looking frantic and disheveled. Chloe must have called them the second she realized the eviction notice was real. Maya, stop this foolishness right now, Brenda shouted, marching across the polished floor with her purse clutched tight like a weapon. She rushed straight to Preston's side, physically placing herself between me and her deceitful son-in-law. You are embarrassing us in public. You leave Preston alone. He is trying to close a major deal and you are throwing a childish tantrum. I looked at my mother, marveling at the depth of her conditioning. Even when faced with the undeniable reality of my success, she instinctively protected the white man who was actively destroying her life. I am not throwing a tantrum, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I am staging an intervention, and you are about to see exactly who you have been protecting. I took the heavy red folder from my assistant. I did not hand it to my father. I dropped it directly onto the floor at his feet. The impact caused the folder to burst open, scattering dozens of bank statements, wire transfer logs, and certified financial records across the ground. "Pick it up, Marcus," I commanded, looking my father dead in the eye. "Look at where your life savings went." Marcus frowned, his knees popping as he bent down to gather the scattered papers. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the highlighted columns. His hands began to shake violently. He looked up at Preston, then down at the papers, his jaw going completely slack. "What is this?" my father whispered, the papers rattling in his trembling grip. "These are my retirement accounts. My pension fund. The balances are gone. They are completely drained." "There is no generational wealth," I announced, projecting my voice so the reality would bounce off the lobby walls and ring in their ears. "There is no trust fund from a good family. Preston has been draining your retirement accounts for the past 2 years to fund his imaginary lifestyle. He used your money to lease his Porsche. He used your money to buy Chloe's designer bags. He used your money to pay for the lobster dinner he tried to stick me with last night." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sob, burying her face in her hands. She knew. She had to have known the money was not coming from a trust, but she was too addicted to the illusion of status to care where the cash originated. My father grabbed Preston by the lapels of his expensive unpaid suit. "You stole from us!" Marcus growled, his voice breaking with devastation. "You took everything I worked 40 years for." Preston shoved my father away roughly. "You willingly signed those investment authorizations," Marcus Preston snarled, dropping the polite son-in-law act completely. "You wanted to be part of a high-level real estate portfolio. It is not my fault the market shifted. That is the risk of doing business." I fully expected my mother to explode in rage at the man who just admitted to robbing her blind. I expected her to comfort my father, to turn to me for help, to finally realize that her worship of Preston's race and perceived status had been a fatal error. Instead, Brenda smoothed her jacket, lifted her chin, and turned her furious gaze entirely on me. "We are not going to be the laughingstock of Atlanta," Brenda hissed, her toxic pride overriding her basic survival instincts. "I will not have my friends at the country club whispering about how my daughter's marriage failed and our family went broke. The white folks in Preston's circle are already looking for a reason to tear us down. I will not give them the satisfaction." She pointed a rigid finger at my chest. "You have billions of dollars, Maya. You own this building. You own our neighborhood. So you are going to fix this. You are going to write a check for $500,000 right now to clear Preston's debts and replenish our retirement. You are going to bail him out so we can maintain our dignity." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by her sickness. She had been financially gutted by a parasite, and her first instinct was to demand her black daughter bleed herself dry to protect the parasite's reputation. "Absolutely not," I said, my tone carrying the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "I am not giving a single dime to fund your delusions. You wanted him as your son. You can enjoy the poverty he brought you." Brenda's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The maternal mask slipped away forever, revealing the ugly, bitter entitlement underneath. "You selfish, ungrateful brat," Brenda screamed, stepping so close to me I could smell her perfume. "You owe us. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. Without my pristine credit score, you would not have even gone to college. You would still be flipping burgers. You owe your entire existence to me." I did not need to say a word. From the shadows of the lobby, my lead corporate attorney David stepped forward. He had been quietly observing the entire exchange, holding a sleek silver tablet in his hands. He walked up to my mother, his face a portrait of icy legal precision. "Actually," Brenda, David said smoothly, tapping the screen of his tablet to pull up a highly classified background check. "It is the other way around." David tapped his sleek silver tablet, projecting a digital dossier onto the presentation screen. The display illuminated the reception area with catastrophic financial records. 10 years ago, David began, his voice cutting through the silent marble lobby. "My firm ran a routine credit sweep when the CEO first established Empire. We discovered massive financial discrepancies attached directly to her social security number. discrepancies we spent the last 5 years tracing back to their exact origin. My mother folded her arms tightly, attempting to maintain her haughty posture, but her eyes darted nervously toward the glowing screen. I do not know what kind of fabricated nonsense you are projecting in my direction, but I will not stand here and be interrogated by a hired suit. David ignored her. He swiped his index finger across the screen. A rapid succession of loan applications, credit card statements, and wire transfers appeared. Every single document bore my legal name, my private social security number, and my clearly forged signature. Between your 18th and 22nd birthdays, David said, addressing me directly, though speaking loudly enough for my parents to hear, Brenda took out over $120,000 in high-interest personal loans using your identity. She systematically defaulted on every single one of them, destroying your credit profile before you even had a chance to build it. The air in the lobby turned to absolute ice. I stared at the screen, my mind racing back to the darkest, most exhausting period of my life. I vividly remembered sitting in the cramped financial aid office at my community college, sobbing uncontrollably in front of an academic advisor who gently told me my student loan applications had been universally rejected due to a catastrophic credit score I knew nothing about. I remembered the crippling physical exhaustion of working 3 separate night jobs. Scrubbing industrial kitchen floors at midnight, waiting tables at dawn, and catering cheap local events just to afford basic used textbooks and instant noodles. Meanwhile, Chloe was handed the keys to a brand new luxury BMW for her college graduation, a car my parents proudly claimed they bought with their hard-earned savings to reward her academic mediocrity. Later, they used those exact same stolen funds to seed Preston's very first failed tech startup, establishing the fraudulent lie of his superior business acumen. They did not just prefer Chloe. They literally mortgaged my future to finance her suburban fairy tale. They used my name and credit to buy Preston's illusion of white success. My father, Marcus, stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Brenda's face lost all its arrogant color, turning a sickly ashen gray. She took a stumbling step back, her designer heels clicking unsteadily on the polished marble floor. "Those records are completely wrong," Brenda stammered, her voice high-pitched and reeking of desperate panic. "It was an administrative mistake. We had shared checking accounts when you were a teenager. It is just a massive misunderstanding with the regional banks. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not recognize misunderstandings," David replied coldly. "We have the exact IP addresses used to submit the fraudulent applications. They trace directly back to your home computer network. We have the routing numbers showing the stolen funds transferring directly into your personal checking accounts and then immediately routing outward to luxury car dealerships and Preston's initial corporate registry fees." Chloe gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands. She looked over at Preston, who was now sweating profusely, realizing the foundation of his generational wealth was built entirely on felony identity theft committed against a young black teenager. I stepped around the security detail and walked slowly toward my mother. Every step I took felt heavy with the profound weight of a decade of unnecessary suffering. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, searching her terrified face for any sign of true maternal guilt, any flicker of genuine remorse for stealing my youth and crushing my financial stability before my adult life had even truly begun. There was absolutely no remorse. There was only the feral, frantic look of a cornered animal realizing she had finally been caught in her own trap. I did not shed a single tear. The deep reservoir of grief I once held for my family had dried up years ago, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve that fueled my corporate empire. My voice turned to absolute ice, dropping to a quiet whisper that carried immense lethal weight across the room. "I thought you just did not love me," I said, holding her panicked gaze without blinking. "I thought you simply preferred Chloe because she was willing to play your toxic games and marry for your twisted idea of status. I accepted that I was the designated family scapegoat. I made my peace with being the unwanted, unloved child. I did not realize you were actively robbing me in the dark." "Maya, please," Brenda whispered, reaching out a violently trembling hand. "You have to understand our position. We desperately needed the money. Preston had such a bright future ahead of him, and Chloe deserved a good start in her marriage. You were always so strong and independent. We knew you would figure it out on your own. And you did figure it out. Look at you now. You are a highly successful billionaire. Her disgusting justification was the final definitive nail in the coffin of our relationship. She was attempting to use my resilience to excuse her blatant criminality. She genuinely believed my ability to survive her abuse, somehow completely absolved her of committing it. You are right, I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. I did figure it out, and I am going to figure this out too. Marcus suddenly lunged forward. Pure panic overriding his common sense, my father sprinted toward David, his hands reaching wildly for the tablet and the physical folders stacked on the nearby reception desk. He actually believed that if he destroyed the digital device in front of him, he could somehow erase the massive footprint of their federal crimes. He did not even make it 2 steps. My armed security guards moved with terrifying practiced speed. 2 massive men intercepted us, effortlessly grabbing him by the shoulders and slamming him face first into the marble wall. Marcus grunted loudly in pain, his cheek pressed flat against the cold stone, his arms pinned securely behind his back in a submission hold. "Let him go right now!" Brenda shrieked, hitting her hands helplessly against the broad chest of another security guard, who quickly stepped between her and my father. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. You are supposed to respect us." I stood perfectly still, watching my father struggling pathetically against the highly trained guards, and my mother descending into total unfiltered hysteria. Preston and Chloe were cowering near the revolving glass doors, absolutely terrified that the guards would come for them next. The grand, arrogant illusion of their superiority had been violently surgically dismantled right in front of their eyes. I looked directly at my mother, my expression completely devoid of any mercy, hesitation, or familial warmth. The time for blind loyalty had permanently expired the exact moment she forged my signature a decade ago. "I am pressing federal fraud charges," I said. The words "federal fraud charges" hung in the icy air of the lobby, while my security team kept my father pinned against the marble, and my mother descended into a hysterical breakdown. Preston did exactly what a parasite does when its host dies. He detached. He did not rush to comfort his sobbing wife. He did not try to defend his wealthy in-laws. He slowly backed away toward the revolving glass doors, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the federal authorities would inevitably trace Brenda's stolen funds directly into his corporate accounts. If my mother was going down for felony identity theft, he was going down for wire fraud, embezzlement, and federal conspiracy. He slipped through the heavy doors and sprinted to his leased sports car, leaving Chloe completely abandoned in the middle of the corporate lobby. Preston drove erratically across downtown Atlanta, breaking every speed limit and swerving through traffic to reach his startup office. The space was a massive, overpriced suite in a trendy tech district financed entirely by the blood and sweat of my stolen future. He burst through the glass doors, his expensive tailored suit now soaked with nervous sweat. The office was empty, the handful of employees he had hired for optics having been dismissed days ago when the payroll accounts started bouncing. He marched past the empty cubicles and practically tore the hinges off his mahogany desk, ripping through drawers to find his emergency go-bag and his passport. His hands were shaking violently as he flipped open his silver laptop. He had exactly $200,000 left in the company operating account. It was the last remaining chunk of seed money he had scammed out of local investors before I revoked his country club membership. He logged into his banking portal, his fingers slipping on the keys, frantically typing in the routing numbers for an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He just needed to hit transfer, grab his bag, and make it to the international terminal at the airport. He would disappear across the globe and let Brenda, Marcus, and Chloe take the entire fall for his crimes. "Preston, what are you doing?" He spun around, nearly knocking his laptop off the desk. Chloe stood in the doorway of his office. Her designer makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. She had taken a rideshare straight from my lobby, clearly hoping to find solace in the arms of her successful husband. Instead, she found him shoving a passport and stacks of loose cash into a leather duffel bag. "You left me there," Chloe cried, stepping into the room with her arms wrapped around herself. Maya is pressing federal charges against Mom. They are going to prison. We have to call your family lawyers right now. We have to use your trust fund to bail them out before they are arrested." Preston let out a harsh, manic laugh. He did not bother hiding his contempt anymore. The polite, charming Southern gentleman routine dissolved instantly, revealing the vicious racist opportunist underneath. "There are no family lawyers," Chloe Preston spat, zipping his duffel bag aggressively. "There is no trust fund. Are you genuinely that stupid? I do not have a single dime to my name, and neither do your idiotic parents. The only reason I married you was because your mother was desperate to parade a white man in front of her country club friends. You people were the easiest marks I ever met." Chloe gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. "You loved me. You said I was different from Maya. You said we were going to build an empire together. I said what I needed to say to get your mother to hand over the cash she stole from your sister," Preston shouted, slamming his fist hard on the desk. "You were a convenient automated teller machine. Your whole family is nothing but gullible trash. You worshipped me just because of the color of my skin and my zip code. You handed me your life savings on a silver platter because you wanted to feel superior to your own sister. You let me drain your parents dry, and now you are all going to burn for it, and I am not sticking around to watch the ashes." Chloe stood paralyzed, her entire universe collapsing in the span of 30 seconds. The man she had weaponized against me, the man she had used to justify her superiority and excuse her cruelty, had just admitted she was nothing more than a racial fetish and a financial stepping stone. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor. Preston ignored her breakdown completely. He turned his back on his sobbing wife and looked at the glowing screen of his laptop. The offshore account routing numbers were locked in. The amount was set to exactly $200,000. He hovered his trembling finger over the trackpad. "Enjoy the federal indictment, sweetheart," Preston sneered over his shoulder. He hit the transfer button. He grabbed the handle of his duffel bag, waiting for the familiar chime of a successful wire confirmation. Instead, a harsh, blaring red error message hijacked his entire screen. He blinked, leaning closer to the monitor. The bold white letters glared back at him in absolute defiance. "Transaction denied, account frozen." Preston hit the refresh key. He hit it again, his fingers slamming against the keyboard in a frantic, unhinged rhythm. Denied. 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 A new window popped up automatically in his email client. It was a formal notification from the corporate banking division. He opened it, his eyes darting frantically across the text. The message was marked urgent. It stated that as of 8 o'clock this morning, Empire Acquisitions, holding the majority debt of his corporate entity, had exercised its legal right to trigger a forensic freeze on all operating accounts pending a federal audit. Preston dropped his duffel bag. The heavy leather hit the floor with a dull thud. He was completely out of time. He was completely out of money. He looked at the error screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. I had anticipated his exact escape route hours before he even knew he needed one. He could not buy a plane ticket. He could not hire a defense attorney. He could not even afford a tank of gas. I was hopelessly trapped in Atlanta, with the absolute certainty that the authorities were already on their way. Preston stared at the frozen screen of his laptop, the harsh red error message burning into his retinas. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. He was completely out of cash, locked out of his own fraudulent accounts, and acutely aware that federal authorities were likely already building a case against him. He needed a massive, untraceable cash injection, and he needed it before Monday morning. He slammed his laptop shut and grabbed his phone, his mind racing through his dwindling list of wealthy contacts. Everyone at the country club had blocked his number. His traditional lending avenues were dead. There was only one place left in Atlanta, where hundreds of millions of dollars would be concentrated in a single room this weekend: the Black Excellence Enterprise Gala. It was the most exclusive high-society philanthropic event in the South, an annual gathering of Black billionaires, venture capitalists, and industry titans. Preston knew that a single handshake deal with the right investor there could provide the offshore bridge loan he needed to flee the country. He also knew getting a ticket legally was absolutely impossible. Using the last favor he had with an underground graphic designer he once stiffed on a catering contract, Preston managed to secure 4 highly convincing forged digital VIP passes. 48 hours later, a standard rideshare vehicle pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Waldorf Astoria. The street was lined with genuine Maybachs, Rolls-Royces, and armored SUVs. Preston stepped out onto the red carpet, tugging at the collar of his suit. Chloe followed, wearing a heavily discounted evening gown she had frantically purchased off the rack. Right behind them emerged my parents, Brenda and Marcus. They were a portrait of desperate manufactured dignity. Marcus was suffocating in a rented, ill-fitting tuxedo that bunched awkwardly at his shoulders. Brenda was wearing a cheap sequined dress, her neck adorned with cubic zirconia. She was trying desperately to pass off as real diamonds. Despite having their entire retirement wiped out and a 30-day eviction notice hanging over their heads, their toxic delusion remained completely intact. Brenda aggressively smoothed the lapels of Marcus's cheap jacket, glaring at the affluent black couples, walking effortlessly past them on the red carpet. "Stand up straight!" Marcus. Brenda hissed, her voice trembling with misplaced arrogance. "Tonight is the night we fix everything. Once Preston gets in there and charms one of these rich investors, he will secure the funding for his real estate deal. We will buy a brand new mansion in a better subdivision, and we will never have to speak to that ungrateful, vindictive daughter of yours ever again. These people have money to throw away. Preston knows exactly how to talk to them. He will have them eating out of the palm of his hand." They genuinely believed it. They actually believed that Preston's mere presence as a white man in a room full of black excellence would automatically command respect and open checkbooks. They thought the same racial hierarchy they worshipped in their own home would save them in the real world. Preston marched toward the velvet ropes with unearned confidence, Chloe clinging tightly to his arm. 2 massive, impeccably dressed security guards flanked the golden stanchions. The lead guard, a man built like a heavyweight boxer, held out a digital scanner. Preston confidently shoved his smartphone forward, displaying the forged QR code. The scanner emitted a loud, sharp, aggressive red buzz. The guard did not even blink. He scanned Chloe's phone next. Another harsh red buzz. He scanned Brenda and Marcus's devices. Red, red. The guard slowly lowered the scanner and crossed his massive arms over his chest. He looked Preston up and down, his expression radiating absolute chilling contempt. "These access codes are counterfeit," the guard said, his deep voice carrying easily over the chatter of the red carpet. "Step out of the line immediately." Preston's face flushed bright crimson. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to deploy the same arrogant intimidation tactics he used on hotel clerks and valets. "There must be a glitch in your cheap system," Preston snapped loudly. "I am a premier venture capitalist. My family is on the VIP guest list. Scan it again and show some respect before I have your job." The guard did not argue. He simply stepped forward, his massive hand clamping down like a steel vise on Preston's shoulder. He twisted Preston's arm slightly, preparing to physically hurl him off the red carpet and onto the public sidewalk. Brenda gasped, covering her mouth in horror, as several high-profile guests stopped to watch the humiliating spectacle. Chloe shrieked, demanding the guard release her husband. High above the lobby, in the private security control room, I sat in a leather chair, staring at a wall of high-definition monitors. I held a sleek 2-way radio transmitter in my manicured hand. I watched Preston squirming in the guard's grip. I pressed the transmission button, speaking directly into the earpiece worn by the lead guard on the red carpet. "Let them in," I instructed smoothly. "Down on the red carpet!" The guard paused. He tapped his earpiece, listening to my voice. He looked at Preston with intense disgust, then abruptly released his shoulder. The guard stepped back and unclipped the velvet rope. "Proceed," the guard muttered coldly. Preston quickly adjusted his wrinkled jacket, flashing a triumphant, arrogant smirk at the guard. He genuinely thought his aggressive white entitlement had just intimidated a professional security team. "See?" Preston scoffed, looking back at my parents. "I told you, you just have to know how to handle these people." They rushed eagerly into the grand, opulent ballroom, completely unaware they had just walked willingly into a trap. The room was breathtaking, filled with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and hundreds of the most powerful business leaders in the nation. Preston immediately began scanning the room like a starving predator looking for prey. His eyes locked onto the front of the room. Standing near the main podium was the keynote speaker for the evening. He was a legendary billionaire, a titan of industry, who controlled one of the largest private equity funds on the eastern seaboard. He was exactly the kind of whale Preston needed to bail him out of his impending federal indictment. Preston practically sprinted across the ballroom, shoving past waitstaff and guests with Chloe, Brenda, and Marcus trailing desperately behind him. He marched right up to the billionaire, flashing his brightest, fakest smile, ready to deliver his fraudulent pitch. "Excuse me, Sir," Preston said loudly, aggressively extending his hand. "I am Preston Vance. I have a highly lucrative commercial real estate opportunity that requires immediate capital, and I know you are a man who recognizes brilliant investments." The billionaire slowly turned around. He did not look at Preston's outstretched hand. He looked at Preston's face with an expression of absolute withering boredom. He took a sip of his champagne and shook his head slightly. "I recognize a desperate criminal when I see one," the billionaire replied, his voice rich and steady. "And I certainly do not invest in men who try to steal from my personal business partner." Preston's hand dropped. His smile vanished. "What are you talking about?" The billionaire gestured toward the main stage. "Allow me to introduce my senior protege." Preston's brain short-circuited. He followed the billionaire's gesture toward the head table where I sat bathed in the warm glow of the stage lights. Yet his toxic arrogance completely overrode his basic cognitive functions. He refused to process the reality sitting right in front of him. Instead of walking away, Preston aggressively stepped sideways, physically blocking the billionaire's line of sight to me. He raised his voice, desperately speaking over the elegant string quartet playing in the background. Sir Preston insisted, flashing a frantic smile. "Do not let petty family drama distract you from a billion-dollar opportunity. It disrupts the entire southern market. We utilize advanced blockchain algorithms to streamline commercial leasing. We just need your capital to scale globally." The billionaire did not blink. He set his champagne flute on a passing waiter's silver tray. He looked Preston up and down with the clinical precision of a surgeon examining a terminal disease. He dismantled Preston's entire existence in exactly 3 sentences. "Your user acquisition model relies entirely on predatory suburban lending," the billionaire stated, his rich voice slicing through Preston's desperation. "Your overhead exceeds your projected 10-year revenue by 400%. And most importantly, you do not actually own the proprietary software you are attempting to sell." Preston gasped, his jaw dropping open. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him. The billionaire knew everything. I had made sure of it. Seeing her husband publicly humiliated, Chloe went into a blind panic. She frantically spun around to the surrounding guests. These were some of the most affluent, powerful Black professionals in the country. Chloe instinctively deployed her favorite weapon. She played the victim. "You have to understand," Chloe whined, her voice cracking, as she grabbed the arm of a woman wearing a custom silk gown. "My sister is standing up there acting like she owns the place, but she is just a bitter caterer. She is obsessed with ruining my husband because he comes from a good white family. She is trying to steal our wealth because she is jealous." Chloe waited for the sympathy she was so used to receiving from our parents. She expected these wealthy strangers to validate her tears. Instead, the surrounding guests offered nothing but absolute freezing silence. The woman in the silk gown slowly pulled her arm out of Chloe's grasp, looking at her as if she had just stepped in something foul. Another elegant couple shook their heads in disgusted pity and turned their backs completely. In that agonizing moment, Chloe realized the devastating truth. Her proximity to Preston's whiteness held zero currency in a room of actual Black wealth. She was exposed as a fraud. The ballroom lights dimmed, signaling the start of the formal program. The billionaire walked smoothly to the main stage, adjusting the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the billionaire announced, his voice echoing through the grand hall. "It is my profound honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, the visionary who owns the very building we are standing in, the founder and chief executive officer of M Empire Maya. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. I stood up from the head table, smoothing the fabric of my tailored emerald suit. I walked up the carpeted steps to the stage with deliberate, measured grace. I took my place at the acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of brilliant, powerful faces. I immediately found Preston and Chloe in the crowd. They were frozen near the back doors, trapped in their rented clothes, completely paralyzed by my elevation. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear and commanding over the premium sound system. "True power in our community is not just about building wealth, it is about protecting it. Far too often, our hardworking families are targeted by parasites masquerading as visionaries. They use fake generational wealth and unearned privilege to siphon resources from our neighborhoods." I kept my eyes locked dead on Preston. He was breathing heavily, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "That is why tonight, I announced, projecting my voice to the very back of the hall. I am establishing a new $10 million venture capital fund dedicated exclusively to young Black entrepreneurs. This fund is designed to completely bypass predatory lenders. We will eradicate the fraudulent investors who seek to exploit our families, and we will replace them with genuine, sustainable economic power." The applause was deafening. The crowd rose to their feet in a massive standing ovation, but Preston could not take it. He had spent the last hour downing glasses of whiskey from passing trays to soothe his severely wounded ego. The alcohol, combined with the catastrophic destruction of his superiority complex, pushed him into a blind, unhinged rage. Preston shoved a woman out of his way and charged the stage. He stormed up the side steps, heavily intoxicated and completely out of control. My private security detail moved to intercept him, but I raised my hand, signaling them to hold back. I wanted everyone in the room to see exactly who he was. Preston lunged toward a secondary podium and grabbed the spare microphone from its stand. His eyes were wild, his hair disheveled from his frantic sprint. "She is an absolute fraud!" Preston screamed into the microphone, his loud voice booming across the shocked ballroom. "Do not give her your money. She is a glorified cook. She stole my legitimate business. She is nothing but a ghetto rat." Before the slur left his mouth, the sound engineer cut his audio feed. The microphone went dead. He tapped it frantically, shouting into the silenced equipment. He slammed his fist against the podium, realizing his voice was erased. Suddenly, the stage lights dropped into total darkness. The massive projector screen behind me flickered to life. A high-definition video began to play. Preston turned his head, dropping the microphone, completely unaware of the absolute devastation awaiting him. The screen illuminated the pitch-black ballroom with the stark, unmistakable fisheye angle of a Ring doorbell camera. The timestamp flashing in the upper right corner read just 48 hours ago. The giant 50-foot projection loomed over Preston, casting an unforgiving, harsh white glow over his terrified face. The audio piped through the premium Gala sound system, crystal clear and utterly inescapable. On the screen, Preston was pacing furiously on his own front porch. His tie was undone, his shirt half unbuttoned, and he was violently kicking the brick pillar near his front door. The tinny, muffled voice of my sister Chloe came through the intercom speaker, pleading with him to keep his voice down because our parents were sleeping in the guest room upstairs. That request was the exact trigger Preston needed to unleash his true self. "I am not lowering my voice for those people," the digital Preston screamed into the doorbell camera, his face contorted in drunken feral rage. "You think I care if your pathetic parents hear me? They are nothing but gullible, desperate marks." A collective sharp gasp echoed across the vast ballroom. Hundreds of Atlanta's most affluent, powerful Black professionals stiffened in their seats. The elegant string quartet had long since stopped playing. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with a lethal, simmering disgust. The video continued to play, offering zero mercy. "You actually think I wanted to marry into your family?" Preston snarled on the giant screen, pointing a trembling, aggressive finger directly at the camera lens. "You think I respect any of you? I only married a Black woman because your parents were so insecure, so desperate for white validation, that they practically begged me to take their money. They handed me their entire life savings on a silver platter, just so they could parade a white man around their cheap suburban neighborhood. They are inferior, uneducated trash, and I am the best thing that ever happened to your pathetic bloodline." He did not stop there. The digital Preston proceeded to drop a relentless, vile string of racial slurs, degrading my parents' humanity, mocking their skin color, and laughing maniacally about how easy it was to drain their retirement accounts simply by flashing a smile and wearing a tailored suit. He bragged about manipulating them into evicting me, calling them the most easily manipulated fools he had ever met in his entire life. Down on the gala floor, the reaction was seismic. These were titans of industry, venture capitalists and philanthropists who had spent their entire lives fighting the exact kind of insidious systemic racism Preston embodied. They stared at the stage with absolute, unadulterated contempt. I did not look at Preston. I looked past the stage, searching the sea of horrified faces until I found table 42. Brenda and Marcus were frozen in their rented formal wear. The color had completely vanished from my mother's face, leaving her a sickly ashen gray. She was clutching her chest with both hands, her fingernails digging so deeply into her skin that I could see her knuckles turning white. The fake diamonds around her neck trembled violently. Beside her, my father looked as though the floor had suddenly opened up and swallowed his entire soul. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide and vacant. They were finally seeing the truth they had spent decades denying. They had sacrificed their own brilliant, hard-working, loyal daughter. They had stolen my identity, ruined my credit, and attempted to render me homeless. And they had done it all for a man who viewed them as subhuman. A man who actively despised their race and laughed at their desperate, toxic need for his approval. The video looped back to the beginning. Preston's racist tirade echoing through the ballroom for a second time, drilling the humiliation deep into my parents' bones. A single spotlight snapped on, illuminating me at the podium. I gripped the edges of the acrylic stand. I did not need a microphone for my voice to carry the absolute devastating finality of this moment. I looked directly down at my parents, holding their terrified, broken gazes. "You traded your own flesh and blood for a man who hates your skin," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence like a sharpened blade. "You sold your soul for proximity to whiteness, and this is exactly what it bought you." Brenda let out a small, strangled sob, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her self-hatred. She reached a shaking hand out toward the stage, but I had already turned my face away from her. She was nothing to me now. Preston snapped out of his paralyzed state. The reality of his absolute destruction finally penetrated his alcohol-soaked brain. The entire room of billionaires was glaring at him. The evidence of his bigotry and his financial crimes was currently playing on a 50-foot screen for the entire world to see. He was cornered, humiliated, and stripped of every single ounce of unearned privilege he had wielded his entire life. He went into a complete, feral, unhinged panic. Preston let out a guttural, incoherent scream of pure rage. He scrambled across the stage and grabbed the dead microphone from the floor. He wound his arm back and hurled the heavy metal microphone directly at the massive projector screen, desperately trying to shatter the image of his own racist face. The microphone bounced harmlessly off the thick canvas fabric and clattered onto the wooden stage floor, achieving absolutely nothing. Realizing he was completely exposed and surrounded by hostile security guards, Preston turned rapidly on his heel. He bolted straight for the back exit of the grand ballroom, sprinting blindly in a desperate bid to escape. As he tore violently through the packed tables, he violently shoved a terrified catering waiter completely out of his path, sending a large silver tray of crystal champagne flutes crashing loudly to the cold, polished marble floor. Preston hit the service doors with his full body weight. They blasted open, spilling him into the humid night air of the loading alley. He scrambled forward, his breath-ragged mind consumed by the desperate need to vanish. He did not make it past the dumpsters. Blinding strobe lights snapped on, illuminating the dark alley with the glare of a stadium. Preston threw his hands up to shield his eyes, staggering backward as tactical boots hit the pavement. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do not move another inch. A dozen armed agents formed a barricade across the alleyway. The lead agent stepped out from behind the flashlights, his badge gleaming against his windbreaker. He knew exactly who he was hunting. Preston Vance, You are under arrest for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal conspiracy to commit identity theft. Preston froze. His arrogant facade evaporated, leaving nothing but a terrified coward. He lowered his hands, shaking his head in frantic denial. He tried to deploy his charm, but his voice cracked in a high-pitched squeal. "There is a mistake," Preston stammered. "I am a legitimate capitalist. My sister-in-law is orchestrating corporate sabotage. She froze my accounts illegally. You have to investigate her, not me." The lead agent did not blink. He pulled out a thick warrant folder. "There is no mistake," the agent replied coldly. "We received a forensic dossier from the legal department of Empire 3 days ago. We have the exact IP addresses you used to funnel stolen funds offshore. We have the forged ledgers you submitted to investors. We also have the paper trail detailing how your mother-in-law stole her daughter's social security number to seed your corporate registry. Your entire life is built on federal felonies." My lawyer David had not just triggered a financial freeze that morning. That was a maneuver to keep him trapped in Atlanta. The real weapon had been deployed 72 hours prior when my team handed over undeniable evidence directly to the United States Attorney's Office. I did not just want to bankrupt Preston, I wanted him permanently removed from society. Realizing he was cornered, Preston made a stupid decision. He lunged right, trying to sprint toward a gap between two delivery trucks. Two federal agents moved with practiced speed. They intercepted Preston effortlessly, grabbing his shoulders and slamming him violently against the brick wall. Preston let out a cry of pain as his rented tuxedo jacket ripped down the seam. The agents kicked his legs apart, patting him down, before pulling his arms behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, locking him into his new reality. At that moment, the service doors burst open again. Chloe stumbled into the alley, her cheap evening gown snagging on the doorframe. She had chased after Preston, desperate to salvage the man she sacrificed her family to secure. Chloe saw the flashing lights reflecting off the brick walls. She saw Preston pressed face first against the masonry, his hands bound behind his back. Her golden ticket to unearned privilege was being hauled away like street trash. She completely lost her mind. "Let him go!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing wildly. She sprinted toward the arresting officers, her heels clicking frantically against the asphalt. "He is a good man. He comes from a good family. You cannot do this to us." "Step back immediately," the agent warned, holding up a firm hand. Chloe ignored the command. Driven by the toxic delusion that she was untouchable by proxy, she launched herself at the agent, reading Preston his Miranda rights. She grabbed the agent by his vest, clawing wildly at his uniform, trying to pull him away from her husband. The response was instantaneous and merciless. The agent grabbed Chloe by the wrist, twisting her arm with a swift maneuver, forcing her to her knees. Chloe screamed in shock as a second agent grabbed her other arm, driving her face down onto the dirty asphalt of the loading dock. Her knockoff heels scraped against the concrete as she thrashed her legs. "Chloe Vance, you are under arrest for assaulting a federal officer," the agent barked, pulling her wrists together. The snap of a second pair of handcuffs echoed through the alley. Chloe sobbed hysterically, her cheek pressed against the ground. She looked up at Preston, begging him to use his imaginary power to save her. Preston refused to look at her. He kept his head turned away, consumed by his impending ruin. The heavy doors swung open. Brenda and Marcus stepped onto the loading dock. They stopped dead, staring at the catastrophic scene unfolding under the strobe lights. Their successful son-in-law was bleeding from his forehead, bound in steel. Their golden child, the daughter they bankrupted me to elevate, was crying in the dirt under arrest. I stepped onto the landing behind them. I stood straight in my tailored suit, holding a flute of vintage champagne. I looked down at the wreckage of my family, feeling absolute clinical satisfaction. Brenda's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the cold concrete, her gown soaking up the dampness. The arrogant matriarch who spent my life telling me I was worthless was finally broken. She looked up, tears streaming down her face, hands clasped in a pathetic gesture of begging. "Maya, please," Brenda sobbed, her voice cracking. "Please tell them to stop. You have the power to fix this. You have the money. We are family. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go to prison. Please, Maya, save us." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. the bubbles were crisp cold and flawless. I lowered the glass, looking at the woman who stole my identity and traded my future for a man who openly despised her. I offered her a cold, empty smile. Real family comes first, right? Exactly 48 hours after federal agents hauled Preston and Chloe out of that loading dock in handcuffs, the sun rose over a very different reality for my parents. The 30-day eviction clock I had legally triggered a month ago officially expired at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Brenda and Marcus were currently sitting on the concrete curb at the end of their sweeping, manicured driveway. The luxury moving company they had tried to book demanded payment up front, money they no longer possessed since their accounts were frozen by the federal fraud investigation. As a result, the remnants of their fraudulent status, obsessed lives were stuffed unceremoniously into heavy-duty black plastic trash bags piled high on the grass. Brenda was wearing the same sweatpants she had thrown on yesterday, her hair completely unkempt. The fake cubic zirconia necklace she wore to the gala was gone, presumably pawned, to afford the prepaid burner phone she was gripping in her shaking hands. She dialed number after number, her voice growing increasingly frantic. "Margaret, please, it is Brenda. We just need your guest house for a few days." The line went dead. "Vivian, we hosted your daughter's bridal shower. You owe us a favor." The call disconnected. She threw the phone onto the grass in a fit of rage. The video of Preston calling them inferior, uneducated trash had spread through Atlanta like a wildfire. The attendees of the Black Excellence Gala had circulated the footage to every country club, every charity board, and every high society network in the state. Brenda and Marcus were not just financially ruined. They were total social pariahs. They had been permanently blacklisted from the very circles they had sacrificed my future to join. No one in the affluent Black community would ever associate with people who sold their souls to a racist con artist. A loud, rumbling diesel engine shattered the quiet suburban morning. Brenda looked up, hoping it was a sympathetic neighbor or a charity service. It was a convoy of massive white box trucks bearing the bold matte black logo of M Empire Property Development. My commercial construction and renovation crew poured out of the vehicles before the engines even fully shut off. Dozens of workers in hard hats and high-visibility vests swarmed the property carrying heavy tools and large demolition bins. The site foreman marched up the driveway holding a digital blueprint tablet. He did not even glance at my parents sitting on the curb among their trash bags. He barked loud orders to his crew. "Rip out the marble foyer first. Take a sledgehammer to that awful faux Tuscan kitchen island. We are gutting this property to the studs, modernizing the floor plan, and flipping it for a premium profit by next quarter. Move fast, people, we have a tight schedule." Brenda screamed, scrambling to her feet as workers casually tossed her custom silk drapery out the front door and straight into a commercial dumpster. She tried to physically block a worker carrying a sledgehammer, screaming that those were her imported French doors, and he had no right to touch them. The foreman stepped in, signaling for my private security officers, who had arrived with the crew to maintain the perimeter. He coldly informed her that she was trespassing on a corporate construction site and would be arrested immediately if she interfered with the demolition. I watched the entire operation unfold from the air-conditioned comfort of my Maybach parked discreetly across the street under the shade of a massive oak tree. I sipped my iced matcha tea, feeling the cool condensation on the glass. There was no joy in my heart, but there was a profound clinical satisfaction. This house had been a monument to their toxic vanity, a structure financed by my stolen identity and ruined credit. Tearing it down to the studs to generate corporate revenue was the ultimate exorcism of my painful past. Marcus spotted my vehicle parked in the shadows. His shoulders slumped, his eyes red and exhausted from days of nonstop panic and public humiliation. He slowly detached himself from Brenda's hysterical screaming and shuffled across the sweltering asphalt toward my car. He looked significantly older, completely broken, stripped of the unearned arrogance he had wielded like a weapon my entire life. He reached my passenger side window and knocked weakly against the heavily tinted, bulletproof glass. I pressed a button on the center console. The window glided down exactly 2 inches, letting in the suffocating heat of the morning and the loud rhythmic crashing of sledgehammers, destroying his former living room. Marcus reached into his breast pocket with a trembling hand. He pulled out a small faded photograph. He pressed it flat against the sliver of exposed glass. It was a picture of me as a toddler sitting on his shoulders at a local park, both of us smiling brightly into the camera. "Maya, please," Marcus begged, his voice cracking with heavy manufactured emotion. "Look at this. Look at how happy we were. You are still my little girl. You are still the baby I carried on my shoulders. I know we made terrible mistakes, but you cannot just erase us like this. You have your revenge. You proved your point to everyone. Please just give us a check so we can get a small apartment. Do not leave your own father to die on the streets." I looked at the photograph. I recognized the desperate manipulative tactic instantly. When bullying and authority failed, they weaponized nostalgia. They tried to extract an empathy they had never earned. I did not blink. I reached into my designer briefcase resting on the leather seat beside me. I pulled out a crisp, folded legal document bearing the official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. I slid the thick paper through the 2-inch gap in the window. The document hit Marcus squarely in the chest, forcing him to drop the baby picture to catch it. He unfolded the paper, his tired eyes scanning the bold black text. It was a permanent court-ordered restraining order. It legally barred Marcus, Brenda, Chloe, and Preston from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, my corporate headquarters, or any property owned by M Empire. I pressed the button on the console. The tinted glass rolled up silently, sealing the cabin and cutting off his panicked protests. I watched my father's face disappear behind the tinted glass of my Maybach. I instructed my driver to pull away from the completely gutted and destroyed remains of my parents' pathetic former life. I did not look back. I had a far more important appointment downtown at the federal courthouse. The long drive into the bustling city was smooth and perfectly air-conditioned. I slowly sipped my iced matcha tea, feeling a profoundly calm and peaceful sense of clarity today. The universe had a fascinating way of balancing the scales, and I was simply the instrument of its absolute justice. The fluorescent lights of the federal arraignment courtroom buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the worn wooden benches. The room smelled of stale coffee and pure desperation. I sat in the very back row, blending into the shadows of the gallery, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal designer blazer. I crossed my legs, resting my hands neatly on my lap, and watched the heavy oak doors beside the judge's bench swing open. A bailiff led my sister Chloe into the room. Gone were the overpriced designer dresses, the flawless silk blowouts, and the arrogant smirk she wore like a crown. She was drowning in an oversized faded Orange County jail jumpsuit. Her wrists and ankles were bound in heavy metal chains that clanked loudly against the linoleum floor with every shuffling, defeated step. Her hair was a matted mess, and her face was puffy and blotchy from 48 straight hours of relentless crying inside a holding cell. She was directed to a battered wooden table where an exhausted public defender was frantically flipping through a stack of manila folders. The lawyer barely looked up to acknowledge her. With my parents' accounts completely frozen and their assets legally seized by my corporate recovery team, they could not afford the high-powered defense attorneys they always bragged about. Chloe was entirely at the mercy of a broken justice system. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman with zero patience for excuses, stood up and addressed the judge. She detailed the serious charges of assaulting a federal officer, resisting arrest, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. But the real devastating blow came when the prosecutor read directly from Preston's sworn deposition secured during his aggressive interrogation just hours prior. According to the sworn statement of Preston Vance, the defendant, Chloe Vance, was the primary architect of the financial embezzlement scheme the prosecutor announced. Mr. Vance claims he was merely the public face of the startup, while his wife utilized her family's stolen credentials and manipulated the illicit financial transfers. He asserts she coerced him into the fraudulent activities to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Chloe physically recoiled, gasping loudly enough for the gallery to hear. She shook her head, leaning toward her public defender, whispering frantically. Her entire toxic worldview was shattering in real time. Chloe believed that marrying a white man with perceived generational wealth was her ultimate shield. She believed proximity to his whiteness elevated her above her own race, above her own family, and certainly above me. She thought his privilege would automatically protect her from any consequence. Instead, the moment federal authorities cornered him, the charming Southern gentleman instantly weaponized the justice system against his black wife. He threw her directly to the wolves without a second of hesitation, using every prejudiced trope to paint her as the aggressive mastermind who corrupted his innocence. The illusion was permanently broken. She was not his queen, she was his scapegoat. The overwhelmed public defender stood up stuttering through a weak argument about Chloe having no prior criminal record and deep ties to the local community. The judge peering over his reading spectacles looked entirely unimpressed by the performance. The charges of assaulting a federal agent are extremely severe, the judge stated, resting his hand near his gavel. Furthermore, considering the ongoing investigation into massive financial fraud and the frozen status of corporate accounts, the defendant represents a significant flight risk. I will set bail at $50,000 cash. The judge looked out into the silent gallery. Are there any family members present today willing to post the $50,000 bond on behalf of the defendant? Brenda and Marcus were sitting 2 rows ahead of me. They had arrived early, looking completely destitute in the same wrinkled sweatpants they wore during their eviction. Upon hearing the judge's question, they frantically whipped their heads around, searching the gallery. Their bloodshot, panic-stricken eyes locked instantly onto me in the back row. Brenda's lips trembled uncontrollably. She silently mouthed the word, "please," clasping her shaking hands together in a begging gesture. Marcus stared at me with wide eyes, silently pleading for me to pull out my checkbook and save his golden child. They knew $50,000 was pocket change to me. They knew I could wire the funds and have Chloe walking out the doors by noon. I met my mother's pleading gaze with absolute indifference. I did not shake my head. I did not whisper a word of refusal. I simply stood up from the wooden bench. I deliberately adjusted the lapels of my designer blazer, smoothing the expensive fabric with precision. Then I turned my back on them and walked purposefully down the center aisle toward the exit doors. My heels clicked in a steady, confident rhythm that echoed loudly in the silent courtroom, drowning out their pleas. Without a sponsor to post the required funds, bail is denied. The judge's voice boomed directly behind me, followed immediately by the sharp final crack of his gavel. The defendant is remanded to county custody pending trial. As I pushed open the courtroom doors, stepping out into the sunlit corridor, a chaotic scuffle erupted inside. I heard the harsh clanking of heavy chains being pulled tight. Then, piercing through the heavy doors, Chloe's voice shrieked in absolute terror. She screamed my name over and over again, her voice cracking with raw desperation as the bailiffs dragged her away to a cold concrete cell. The agonizing sound of Chloe screaming my name faded behind the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. I walked out into the blinding Atlanta sun, feeling an absolute profound emptiness. I felt no guilt, no sorrow, and no hesitation. I experienced only the clean, sterile reality of severe consequence. I climbed into the back of my waiting armored vehicle and instructed my driver to take me directly to the corporate headquarters. There were massive multi-million-dollar commercial acquisitions to finalize before the end of the fiscal quarter, and the federal criminal justice system was handling the trash disposal perfectly fine without my continued supervision. The underground executive parking garage of my corporate high-rise was a fortress of steel glass and polished concrete. My driver pulled into my reserved space near the brightly lit private lobby entrance. As my security detail opened the heavy passenger door for me, a sudden frantic scuffling noise echoed loudly from the dark shadows behind a concrete pillar. Someone had bypassed the outer security perimeter, likely slipping through the loading dock gates right behind a catering delivery van. Out of the dim lighting stumbled Brenda. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. She looked completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, perfectly manicured matriarch who had sat at the elite steakhouse just a few weeks prior. Her hair was frizzy and heavily unkempt, lacking the expensive weekly salon treatments she relied on to project her false wealth. She wore a stained, oversized sweater and cheap, scuffed sneakers. The heavy dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent terrified of the impending federal indictment bearing down on her. Maya Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing wildly in the cavernous garage. She sprinted toward me, her arms flailing in pure desperation. My private security detail immediately unholstered their tasers and stepped aggressively in front of me, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of muscle. Brenda slammed hard into them, clawing at their tactical vests, desperate to bypass them and reach me. "Stand down," I instructed my guards, my voice completely steady and barely above a whisper. They parted just enough to let me look at her, though they kept their hands hovering securely near their tactical belts. Brenda dropped to her knees, breathing heavily. She looked up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "You have to stop this," she gasped, gripping the hem of my designer trousers before a guard swiftly kicked her hand away. "The federal prosecutor sent a plea deal to my public defender this morning. They want me to serve a minimum of 4 years in federal prison for the identity theft. 4 years. I am too old to survive in a federal cage. You have the power to call off your lawyers. You can drop the civil suit and tell the feds it was a misunderstanding." I stared down at her, my expression completely blank and devoid of any maternal sympathy. "You should have considered your survival odds before you forged my signature on those high-interest loan applications," I replied smoothly, realizing that playing the helpless, fragile victim was yielding zero results. Brenda immediately resorted to her oldest, most toxic weapon. She deployed the ultimate maternal guilt trip. She scrambled to her feet, her face twisting into a hideous mask of aggressive, desperate entitlement. "I am your mother," Brenda screamed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "I carried you in my womb for 9 agonizing months. I gave you life. I fed you. I clothed you. I put a roof over your head when you were too small to fend for yourself. You owe me your entire existence. You cannot let the woman who gave birth to you rot in a federal penitentiary. You owe me everything you have." Her words dripped with the transactional, manipulative poison she had used to control me. My entire childhood. She genuinely believed that basic biological reproduction gave her a lifetime pass to commit felony financial abuse against her own offspring. She viewed motherhood not as a bond of unconditional love, but as a strict ledger of debts I was legally obligated to repay with blind loyalty. "You are absolutely right, Brenda," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the vast concrete structure. "Motherhood is a ledger, and I am a highly successful businesswoman who prefers to keep her corporate books perfectly balanced." I calmly reached into my sleek leather designer briefcase. I pulled out a crisp, heavy stock document neatly enclosed in a transparent presentation folder. I stepped around my security guards and extended my arm, handing the document directly to her. Brenda snatched it from my fingers, her eyes darting frantically across the bold black text printed on my corporate letterhead. "What is this?" she stammered, her hands shaking violently. "It is a meticulously detailed, itemized invoice," I explained, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. "My accounting team spent the entire weekend running the numbers. We calculated the exact inflation-adjusted cost of housing, feeding, and clothing me from the day I was born until the day I turned 18. That financial figure is listed at the very top." Brenda stared at the number, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. However, I continued pacing slowly and deliberately around her paralyzed form. "We then deducted the exact market value of my unpaid labor. We deducted the thousands of hours I spent deep cleaning your house because you refused to hire professional help. We deducted the massive catering jobs I executed entirely for free to impress your country club friends, providing you with immense social capital. We deducted the childcare services I provided for Chloe while you were out socializing with people who now refuse to speak to you." I stopped right in front of her, leaning in slightly so she could hear every single syllable with crystal clarity. "Then we added the $120,000 in fraudulent debt you maliciously racked up in my name. We applied a standard commercial interest rate of 18% compounded annually over the last decade, accounting for the massive financial damage and the cruel denial of my student loans." Brenda scanned to the bottom line of the heavy document. Her breathing stopped completely. The grand total she owed me was astronomical, legally binding, and backed by a mountain of irrefutable federal evidence. "If you review the final balance at the bottom of the page," Brenda, you will see that our accounts are officially settled. I stated, my tone possessing the lethal calm of a corporate executioner. I do not owe you a single cent. I do not owe you an ounce of loyalty. And I certainly do not owe you my protection from the federal justice system. You cannot do this to me! Brenda wailed, the thick paper slipping from her trembling fingers and falling onto the cold ground. She fell to her knees again, the fight completely draining out of her body. She collapsed onto the polished marble flooring of the lobby entrance, her hands covering her face as loud, pathetic sobs echoed through the parking garage. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman who had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was inferior. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt nothing but the pure, unadulterated freedom of a zero balance. I paid my debt to you the day I survived your parenting, I said. I turned my back on her and walked through the gleaming glass doors into the private lobby. I stepped into my exclusive executive elevator. As the brushed steel doors smoothly slid shut, the very last thing I saw was Brenda sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, clutching the invoice that finalized her total ruin. 6 months after those brushed steel elevator doors closed on my mother, I walked through a set of heavy mahogany doors into a federal courtroom. The air conditioning in the Richard B. Russell Federal Building hummed loudly, creating a sterile and unforgiving atmosphere. I took my assigned seat in the front row of the gallery, crossing my legs and smoothing the immaculate fabric of my tailored navy suit. I directed my gaze to the defense table. Preston looked absolutely unrecognizable. The arrogant Southern gentleman facade had been entirely stripped away, replaced by the stark reality of federal detention. He wore an ill-fitting bright orange county jumpsuit that hung loosely off his significantly diminished frame. His skin was pale and deeply sallow, deprived of the expensive country club sunlight he used to bask in. His hands trembled uncontrollably as they rested flat on the wooden table, the heavy steel handcuffs clanking softly against the surface every time he shifted his weight. He did not possess a single ounce of the unearned white privilege he used to wield like a weapon. He was just a terrified, cornered criminal facing the absolute end of his life. The trial for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal conspiracy had commenced earlier that week. The prosecution had laid out a devastating, methodical case, but Preston's high-priced defense attorney, paid for by the final scraps of credit his distant relatives could scrape together, was currently attempting a desperate Hail Mary strategy. The defense lawyer stood before the jury box, pacing slowly, projecting a tone of profound manufactured sympathy. He painted Preston not as a malicious predator, but as a naive, misunderstood young entrepreneur. The lawyer gestured toward Preston, claiming his client was a visionary, whose only crime was falling in love with a woman from a demanding, financially illiterate family. The defense attorney spun a disgusting, racially coded narrative for the jury. He argued that Preston was relentlessly overwhelmed by his black in-laws. He claimed Brenda and Marcus constantly pressured Preston to fund their lavish suburban lifestyle, driving the poor, stressed businessman to make desperate, unauthorized financial transfers simply to keep his demanding new family satisfied. They bled him dry, the lawyer proclaimed dramatically, trying to shift the blame entirely onto the very people Preston had robbed blind. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of clinical detachment, listening to this pathetic attempt to weaponize racial stereotypes in a federal courtroom. They were trying to frame Preston as the victim of greedy black people. It was an insulting, desperate tactic, and it was about to fail spectacularly. The prosecution called their primary witness and majority debt holder to the stand. I stood up, adjusting my blazer, and walked past the defense table. Preston refused to look at me, staring intensely at his chained hands. I stepped into the witness box, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. I adjusted the microphone, looking directly at the 12 jurors who held Preston's fate in their hands. The federal prosecutor approached the podium. "Can you please state your name and your professional relationship to the defendant?" "I am Maya, Chief Executive Officer of M Empire Acquisitions. I am the sole proprietor of the corporate debt portfolio previously held by the defendant's defunct real estate startup." Over the next 20 minutes, I delivered a masterclass in financial forensics. I did not speak with anger or emotion. I spoke in cold, hard, undeniable data. When the prosecutor asked about the defense's claim that Preston was forced into embezzlement by demanding in-laws, I did not hesitate. I pulled out the certified digital ledgers I had personally audited. The defense claims the defendant was financially drained by his wife's family. I stated clearly, my voice projecting across the silent courtroom. That is a mathematical impossibility. The forensic accounting proves that Preston did not possess a single dollar of personal capital when he married into that family. He did not fund their lifestyle. He orchestrated their complete financial ruin to fund his own. I directed the jury's attention to the specific evidentiary exhibits displayed on the courtroom monitors. I detailed the exact dates, times, and IP addresses of the fraudulent wire transfers. Exhibit A shows the defendant deliberately routing $60,000 from Marcus and Brenda's retirement accounts directly into a shell corporation registered in Delaware, I explained, watching the jurors frantically taking notes. Exhibit B shows those exact funds being used 3 days later to pay for the defendant's luxury vehicle lease and his private country club membership dues. He was not overwhelmed by their demands. He was a systematic parasite operating a highly calculated scheme. Furthermore, the seed money for his corporate registry was obtained through identity theft committed against me, his sister-in-law. He knew the capital was stolen, and he utilized it anyway, to project a false image of generational wealth. The defense attorney attempted a hostile cross-examination, trying to rattle me by questioning my motives for buying his client's debt. He accused me of harboring a personal vendetta. I shut him down in 2 sentences. I am a commercial real estate mogul, managing a billion-dollar portfolio, I replied, staring the defense lawyer straight in the eye. I purchased distressed debt to liquidate assets for corporate profit. The defendant's personal failures are entirely irrelevant to my bottom line. The defense attorney stammered, realizing he could not pierce my absolute professional armor. He had no counter-argument for the hard financial data. He sat down completely defeated. I stepped down from the witness box, walking past Preston one more time. He was visibly shaking his eyes wide with the realization that I had just nailed his coffin shut. The closing arguments wrapped up shortly after my testimony. The judge instructed the jury, and they filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The tension in the federal building was thick and suffocating. Preston sat at the defense table, chewing aggressively on his fingernails, whispering frantically to his lawyer, who simply stared at the floor. They did not have to wait long. The system Preston thought would protect him had turned entirely against him. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy wooden doors opened, and the jury filed back into their seats. The speed of the deliberations signaled an absolute bloodbath. The courtroom fell dead silent as the judge addressed the jury foreman. "Have you reached a verdict? We have your honor." The foreman stood up, holding a single sheet of paper. He cleared his throat, his voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of corporate embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of federal conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all counts." The word echoed like a gunshot. Preston let out a loud, strangled gasp. His knees buckled entirely, and he collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, his chained hands hitting the table with a loud metallic clatter. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He began to hyperventilate, shaking his head in absolute shattered disbelief. The illusion of his superiority was officially dead. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, staring down at the broken man sitting at the defense table, and prepared to read the final devastating sentence. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed like thunder through the silent courtroom. The judge adjusted his dark robes and leaned forward, his stern gaze locked entirely on the defendant. Preston trembled violently, his breath hitching audibly in his chest as he waited for the final blow. The judge did not offer a single ounce of sympathy to the man cowering before him. He spoke with the absolute, uncompromising authority of the federal justice system, dismantling every last shred of Preston's arrogant entitlement piece by piece. He listed the devastating impacts of the wire fraud, the corporate embezzlement, and the malicious conspiracy to commit identity theft against a hard-working black woman whose only crime was outworking him in every single conceivable way. The judge made it abundantly clear that white-collar crime driven by racial malice and predatory greed would not be tolerated in his courtroom. He emphasized that the defendant had used his unearned privilege to deceive, manipulate, and destroy the lives of those who had foolishly trusted him. Then came the sentence, delivering a massive fatal blow. For the charges of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal conspiracy, the judge declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. I sentence you to exactly 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Furthermore, due to the severity, the devastating scale, and the highly premeditated nature of these financial crimes, this sentence will be served in its entirety, without the slightest possibility of early parole. Preston let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. His knees gave out completely, and his defense attorney had to physically grab his arm to keep him from sliding out of his chair onto the hard courtroom floor. 8 years. It was an absolute eternity. It was the permanent destruction of his youth, his false status, and his freedom. He spun around in his chair, desperate for a lifeline, panting like a cornered animal. His frantic, tear-filled eyes searched the gallery until they landed on the second row. Sitting there rigid and pale were his own parents. They had refused to attend the trial until today, completely humiliated by the national media coverage surrounding his racist Ring camera rant. Preston reached his chained hands toward them, silently begging his mother and father to do something, to hire a better lawyer, to buy his way out of this escalating nightmare. Instead of rushing forward to comfort their sobbing son, his parents reacted with total freezing disgust. His father slowly shook his head, his face a mask of profound shame and utter disappointment. His mother physically turned her entire body away, refusing to even look at the convicted felon wearing her family name. They stood up together, buttoned their coats, and walked purposefully out of the courtroom without casting a single backward glance. They abandoned him exactly the way he had abandoned his basic humanity. Preston was completely and utterly alone in a room full of people who despised him. 2 heavily armed federal marshals approached the defense table immediately. They grabbed Preston by his upper arms, hauling him to his feet with practiced rough efficiency. As they secured the heavy metal transport chains around his waist and wrists, Preston turned his head and looked across the center aisle. He looked directly at me. I sat perfectly upright in the front row of the gallery, my tailored designer suit impeccable, my posture radiating absolute untouchable power. Preston's eyes were wide and pleading, completely stripped of every single ounce of the unearned Southern gentleman charm he had weaponized for years. He was waiting for me to show a sliver of pity, hoping to see some sign that the empathetic, supportive sister-in-law he had ruthlessly exploited still existed somewhere deep inside me. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I did not offer him a single shred of grace. I simply tilted my head, letting the corners of my mouth curl up into a sharp, deeply condescending smile. I gave him the exact same arrogant, dismissive sneer he had given me in my glass office months ago when he dropped that fraudulent eviction notice on my desk. I reflected his own toxic arrogance right back into his terrified eyes, amplifying it 1,000 times over. His breath caught in his throat as the realization finally crashed down on him. I was the sole architect of his total ruin, and I enjoyed every single second of it. The marshals shoved Preston forward, marching him roughly toward the side-holding cell door. He stumbled over his own feet, sobbing openly and gasping for air as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, sealing away his freedom for nearly a decade. Before the echo of the slamming door could even fade from the quiet courtroom, the heavy wooden double doors at the very back of the gallery swung open. 2 county bailiffs marched down the center aisle, firmly guiding the next defendant toward the front tables to face the judge. It was my sister Chloe. She was being brought in for her final plea deal hearing. My sister looked completely and utterly devastated. She had been brutally stripped of her designer gowns, her expensive jewelry, and her toxic vanity. She wore a faded, oversized beige county jail uniform that made her look incredibly small and fragile. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and heavy, dark circles framed her exhausted, bloodshot eyes. She looked like a woman who had not slept peacefully in 6 months. As the bailiffs directed her to the defense table, Chloe stopped walking. She slowly turned her head and locked eyes with me, sitting in the front row. In that agonizing silent moment, I saw the absolute clarity wash over her exhausted face. She finally understood the true predatory nature of the monster she had married, and she finally recognized the terrifying, relentless, undeniable power of the sister she had so foolishly betrayed. The judge did not waste a single breath on pleasantries as he ordered Chloe to face the bench. Her overwhelmed public defender stood awkwardly by her side, clutching a thin file folder that contained the absolute surrender of her entire life. Chloe had spent her adult years believing that marrying into perceived white wealth would automatically grant her immunity from the consequences of her own terrible choices. She thought her proximity to Preston shielded her from the harsh realities of the justice system. Standing in a faded county jail uniform with her wrists shackled together, she was forced to face the exact same unforgiving system she had once eagerly watched destroy other Black people on the evening news. The federal prosecutor stood up and read the terms of the heavily negotiated plea agreement into the official court record. In exchange for avoiding a lengthy prison sentence for assaulting a federal officer and her documented complicity in Preston's massive financial crimes, Chloe was required to accept a profoundly brutal alternative. The prosecutor listed the conditions with clinical precision. She would endure 5 years of severe, intensely monitored federal probation. She was ordered to pay massive financial restitution to the victims of the wire fraud, a debt that would automatically garnish her wages for the rest of her natural life. Finally, the prosecutor announced the condition that would break Chloe's fragile ego permanently. She was mandated to complete 1,000 hours of manual supervised community service. Chloe stood before the judge, trembling violently as the heavy weight of her new reality crushed her completely. When the judge asked for her plea, she did not look back at the gallery. She did not look for our parents who were likely sitting in their cramped, dark apartment, completely destitute and incapable of saving her. She kept her head bowed, staring at her chained hands, and whispered the word guilty into the courtroom microphone. The judge struck his gavel, officially branding her a convicted felon. She was stripped of her voting rights, her passport, and every last delusion of superiority she had hoarded since childhood. 2 weeks later, Chloe reported for her very first day of court-mandated community service. She had to take a public city bus at 5 in the morning to reach the downtown district because her luxury SUV had been seized by federal asset forfeiture agents. She stepped off the bus wearing cheap, unbranded sweatpants and a standard-issue bright neon orange safety vest with the words "Community Service" stenciled in bold black letters across the back. She was directed to a massive, newly renovated facility in the heart of Atlanta. It was a sprawling, state-of-the-art transitional housing and women's shelter designed to serve hundreds of displaced families. As Chloe walked through the heavy glass doors, a stern site supervisor handed her a heavy mop, a pair of thick yellow rubber gloves, and a plastic bucket reeking of harsh industrial bleach. Chloe dragged the bucket toward the main dining hall, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. She was accustomed to dining at country clubs, mocking my catering business and treating service workers like invisible dirt. Now she was the invisible dirt. As she bent down to fill her bucket at the industrial sink, her eyes caught the gleaming reflection of a massive solid bronze dedication plaque mounted prominently on the main lobby wall. She squinted, reading the bold, elegant engraving. The plaque proudly announced that this entire shelter, including its culinary training center and emergency housing wings, was fully funded, built and operated by the philanthropic division of Empire. Chloe dropped her mop. The heavy wooden handle clattered loudly against the spotless tile floor. The air rushed completely out of her lungs. She was not just performing manual labor to satisfy a federal judge. She had been assigned to scrub the floors of a charitable facility fully owned by the exact same sister she had tried to leave homeless. The catering business she had spent years laughing at had expanded into a corporate empire so massive that it was literally putting a roof over the heads of Atlanta's most vulnerable citizens, while simultaneously providing the floor Chloe was currently ordered to wash. Before Chloe could even process the suffocating irony of her situation, the heavy double doors at the front of the shelter swung wide open. A wave of crisp morning air swept through the lobby, followed immediately by the sharp, authoritative click of expensive designer heels. I walked into the facility flanked by my executive board of directors and the shelter's general manager. I was conducting a routine quarterly executive walkthrough to ensure our funding was being allocated efficiently. I wore a pristine, tailored ivory pantsuit that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the shelter. My posture was impeccable, my expression focused and entirely professional. I listened intently as the shelter manager provided updates on the culinary training program, pointing out the new industrial ovens we had installed last month. I guided my executive team through the main corridor, moving directly toward the expansive dining hall. Chloe was on her hands and knees near the baseboards. She was aggressively scrubbing a sticky spill off the tile, wearing her bright orange vest and yellow rubber gloves. She heard the distinct rhythmic clicking of my heels approaching. She knew exactly who was walking down that hallway. Panic seized her entire body. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She froze, completely clutching a soapy sponge in her trembling hand. She expected me to stop. She expected me to stand over her, to point and laugh, to deliver a long, vindictive speech about karma and justice. She braced herself for the crushing verbal humiliation she knew she absolutely deserved. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, refusing to look up, bracing for the impact of my wrath. I walked right up to the spot where she was kneeling. I stopped my progression, causing my executive team to pause behind me. I looked down at the top of Chloe's messy, unkempt hair. I looked at her cheap sweatpants and her neon orange vest. I saw the absolute pathetic ruin of a woman who had traded her own blood for a racist illusion that ended up destroying her. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no pity. I felt the pure, unadulterated power of total indifference. I turned my head slightly, looking directly at the shelter director standing beside me. "Make sure she does not miss a single spot," I instructed, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I did not wait for a response. I did not give Chloe a second glance. I simply continued walking down the hallway, the sharp click of my heels fading into the distance, leaving her completely trapped on her knees in a puddle of dirty bleach water. The sharp click of my heels faded into the distance, leaving the shelter behind. My focus shifted to the final loose ends in my personal ledger. The federal justice system had been grinding away at the felony identity theft case against my parents. While Preston earned his 8-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary, Brenda and Marcus were out of financial resources and legal maneuvering room. They faced a mountain of irrefutable evidence, faced with spending their remaining years in a federal cage. My parents accepted a brutally uncompromising plea deal. They avoided prison time, but the financial restitution demanded by the court was catastrophic. The judge ordered them to repay every cent of the fraudulent debt they racked up in my name, adjusted for a decade of commercial interest plus severe punitive damages. Because they had no liquid capital left after Preston drained their accounts, the federal government seized absolutely everything else they possessed. The state auctioned off their remaining luxury vehicles to the highest bidder. The designer Brenda had hoarded for years were confiscated to pay down court fees. Even the expensive antique furniture they had managed to salvage from the eviction was liquidated. They were systematically stripped of every single superficial marker of the false wealth they had worshipped their entire lives. With their credit scores annihilated and their names permanently flagged in the National Registry, no reputable landlord in Georgia would approve their applications. The couple who once hosted lavish country club dinners was forced to relocate to a tiny, decaying one-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of Atlanta. It was a crumbling brick building situated next to a busy commercial freight train track. There was no central air conditioning, no marble countertops, and absolutely no neighbors they could impress. The pressure of their newfound poverty acted like a powerful corrosive acid on their already fragile, toxic marriage. Without the illusion of money to bind them together, they instantly turned on each other like starving wolves. I knew this pathetic fact because the undeniable evidence of their mutual destruction was currently sitting right on my mahogany desk. I was seated in my pristine corner office on the 60th floor of the massive Empire headquarters. The room was a sanctuary of minimalist perfection, featuring panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, sleek custom walnut furniture, and the quiet, productive hum of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate operating at peak efficiency. My executive assistant had just brought in my morning mail, carefully placing two slightly crumpled handwritten envelopes directly on the center of my desk. I recognized the desperate, shaky handwriting immediately. One envelope was from Marcus, the other was from Brenda. They had been mailed separately from the same zip code, arriving on the exact same day. I slowly opened the stained envelope from my father first. The paper was cheap and thin. Marcus had written a long, rambling letter attempting to rewrite the history of our family. He claimed he had always been a silent victim of Brenda's aggressive manipulation. He insisted he never wanted to steal my social security number, stating Brenda forced him into compliance by threatening to leave him. He painted himself as a helpless bystander. He ended the letter begging for a small monthly allowance, promising to divorce my mother immediately if I sent him enough money to secure a private apartment away from her screaming. I placed his pathetic letter down and opened the wrinkled envelope from Brenda. The irony was staggering. Her letter was nearly identical in its refusal to accept accountability. Brenda wrote that Marcus was a weak provider who failed to generate enough wealth to secure their social standing. She claimed she only took out those fraudulent loans because Marcus could not afford Chloe's lifestyle, and she was terrified of looking destitute. She cast herself as a sacrificial matriarch who broke the law out of desperate maternal instinct. She ended her letter demanding I forgive her, insisting that since she was suffering in a roach-infested apartment, my debt to her was paid in full. She begged for a private meeting to reconcile. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and looked at the two letters resting side by side on my pristine desk. They were a perfect, tragic representation of everything wrong with my biological family. Even after losing their home, their freedom, their social standing, and their favorite golden son-in-law, they still possessed zero capacity for self-reflection. They were entirely incapable of genuine remorse. They were simply two toxic, narcissistic strangers attempting to sell each other out to secure a final payday from the daughter they had spent 30 years trying to destroy. I did not feel a single fleeting ounce of anger toward them. I did not feel the urge to draft a scathing reply outlining their hypocrisy. I did not feel the need to call my security team to gloat. The profound indifference I felt was the ultimate confirmation of my total healing. They were completely irrelevant to my existence. I calmly picked up both letters, aligning the paper edges perfectly together. I leaned over and slid the cheap handwritten pages directly into the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder positioned next to my desk. The heavy shredder hummed loudly, the sharp steel blades effortlessly chewing through their pathetic excuses and desperate manipulations. The machine ground their toxic words into tiny, illegible strips of garbage, dropping them into the waste bin where they belonged. The sound was incredibly satisfying, a mechanical symphony of absolute, undeniable finality, as the mechanical hum of the shredder faded into complete silence. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite smoothly slide open. My lead assistant walked into the room holding a sleek digital tablet, wearing a crisp, professional smile. Madam CEO, my assistant, announced brightly, stepping forward with absolute deference and respect. Your luggage has been loaded and your private jet to Paris is ready for departure. I nodded to my assistant, grabbing my tailored coat and stepping out of the office. The private flight across the Atlantic was nothing short of absolute perfection. Free from the heavy, suffocating weight of my biological family, I slept deeply and peacefully for the first time in my entire adult life. When the wheels of my jet touched down on the tarmac in France, I stepped out into the crisp, cool European air. I was not just on a vacation. I was embarking on a victory lap. 72 hours later, I sat at a premier corner table on the terrace of a Michelin star restaurant in the heart of Paris. The afternoon sun bathed the historic city in a warm, golden glow. Directly across the Seine River, the Eiffel Tower stood tall and magnificent against a cloudless blue sky. A gentle breeze brushed past me, carrying the rich, savory scent of roasted garlic and fresh truffles from the kitchen. I leaned back in my plush velvet chair, adjusting the cuffs of my custom silk blouse. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the profound silence of my new reality settle completely into my bones. My table was covered in an extravagant spread of the finest culinary masterpieces the city had to offer. There was butter-poached lobster with caviar, a perfectly seared Wagyu fillet roasted seasonal vegetables, and delicate handcrafted pastries. I picked up my silver fork and reached for a generous piece of the lobster. As I brought the rich, decadent food to my lips, a vivid memory flashed through my mind. I remembered sitting in that dark, stuffy private dining room in Atlanta. I remembered my sister Chloe viciously slapping my hand away from the center plate, sneering at me and commanding me not to fill my plate because I had not paid for the meal. I remembered my mother smiling in quiet approval, eagerly protecting the fragile ego of her deceitful, racist son-in-law while treating her own flesh and blood like a parasitic burden. They had mocked my appetite, ridiculed my career, and tried to strip me of my basic human dignity to serve their twisted pursuit of white validation. I chewed the tender lobster, slowly savoring every single flavor profile. The contrast between that miserable night in Georgia and this sun-drenched afternoon in Paris was absolute poetry. Back then, they told me I was a failure who could not afford to eat at their table. Today, I own the table. I own the restaurants. I own the commercial real estate they were built on. I had constructed a billion-dollar international conglomerate from the ashes of their abuse. I did not just earn my seat. I bought the entire building. A distinguished French waiter approached my table with a polite, deferential bow. He carried a polished silver tray, holding the leather billfold for my extensive meal. Before he could place the tray on the white linen tablecloth, a loud, intrusive voice interrupted the quiet elegance of the terrace. "Allow me to take care of that," a man said from the adjacent table. I turned my head slowly. Sitting a few feet away was an older, wealthy white businessman, wearing an expensive linen suit. He had been watching me for the past hour, nursing a glass of scotch with a familiar, arrogant smirk on his face. He possessed the exact same entitled, patronizing energy that Preston had weaponized for years. He looked at me, a successful black woman dining entirely alone in one of the most exclusive establishments in the world, and his fragile worldview immediately assumed I required a financial benefactor. "I insist," the businessman continued, offering a condescending smile as he pulled a corporate credit card from his designer wallet. "A lovely lady like yourself should not have to worry about the check at a place like this. Consider it a gift." He held his card out to the waiter, fully expecting me to blush, giggle, and express profound gratitude for his unsolicited charity. He expected me to shrink into the submissive, grateful role men of his status always demanded from women who looked like me. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not smile. My expression remained a portrait of absolute, freezing, polite indifference. "I appreciate the offer," I said, my voice smooth, commanding, and carrying effortlessly across the quiet terrace. "But I prefer to manage my own investments." I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my solid metal invitation-only black card. The heavy matte black titanium gleamed in the Parisian sunlight. I did not hand it to the waiter. I dropped it directly onto the silver tray. The heavy metal hit the polished silver with a loud, sharp, undeniable clack that echoed sharply. The waiter immediately stepped back, bowing his head in total respect. "Right away, madam." The white businessman froze, his hand still awkwardly suspended in the air, holding his standard corporate card. The arrogant smirk completely melted off his face, replaced by a sudden jarring wave of embarrassment. He slowly lowered his hand, his cheeks flushing a bright, humiliated crimson. He quickly turned his gaze away, staring intensely at his Scotch glass, thoroughly crushed by his own monumental miscalculation. I turned my attention back to my spectacular view of the Eiffel Tower. The waiter returned moments later, respectfully handing back my metal card, along with a complimentary glass of vintage champagne courtesy of the chef. I picked up the crystal flute by its delicate stem. I sat in the sun, entirely unbothered, completely untouched by the toxic family I had systematically dismantled, and the arrogant men I effortlessly outclassed. The air around me was quiet, safe, and completely mine. I raised the glass of vintage champagne in a silent, solitary toast to myself, to my resilience, and to the massive, undeniable empire I had built with my own two hands. I took a slow, deeply satisfying, guilt-free bite of my meal, letting the absolute perfection of the moment wash over me. The ultimate revenge was not destruction. It was living beautifully, thriving, unapologetically, and remaining forever out of their reach. The bright Parisian sun continued to shine as the scene faded to black. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that your worth is never determined by those who are too broken to see it. For years, Maya's family equated success with proximity to whiteness and superficial status, eagerly sacrificing their own flesh and blood to maintain a toxic illusion. They weaponized obligation and manipulated the concept of family to drain her resources and spirit. However, Maya proved that biological ties do not grant anyone the right to abuse you. True power comes from recognizing your own value and having the unwavering courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. She taught us that establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a profound act of self-preservation. You do not have to absorb the poison of a dysfunctional family just because you share their DNA. Healing often requires leaving the architects of your pain behind and building your own empire from the ground up. The greatest revenge is simply living a beautiful, unbothered life. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe for more empowering stories.